He didn't look like a rebel, he looked like a professor. Yet on college campuses across America, Cliffe Knechtle became a legend, not by shouting louder, but by listening first. For decades, he practiced a style of dialogue that felt out of place in a world addicted to outrage. But that same style would one day go viral. This is the story of how a quiet seminary graduate turned tough questions about faith, science, and morality into unforgettable moments. To understand the man who would spend his life engaging with skeptics, you have to understand the world that made him. Cliffe was born in New York City in 1954. His intellectual journey kicked off at Davidson College in North Carolina, a place that sharpened his mind but didn't quite ignite his calling. That spark came later, in the late 1970s, inside the deeply religious and academically intense world of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Now, think about it. Seminaries are bubbles by design. They're spiritual incubators, where faith is strengthened, theology is organized, and future church leaders are made. Gordon Conwell was no different. It was a world of believers, where the core truths of Christianity were the starting point for every conversation, not something to be debated. The air was thick with a shared language of faith that was spoken fluently inside, but was basically a foreign tongue to the world outside. It was right there, in that bubble, that a deep sense of unease began to grow in Cliffe. While his classmates and professors were focused on ministering to the flock, to those already in the church, Cliffe felt a pull in the exact opposite direction. He got hung up on one simple nagging question. What about everyone else? What about the millions of people outside these walls, the ones who didn't speak the language of faith? He felt a deep, almost gnawing conviction that the most important conversations about God weren't happening inside the church at all, but far beyond it. This feeling sharpened into a very specific mission: to reach non-Christians. This wasn't just a side project. It took over his entire education. While others studied how to care for a congregation, Cliffe obsessed over how to talk about faith in a world that was growing more secular and skeptical by the day. He saw a huge gap between the seminary world and the university campus. On one side, you had answers, tons of them, all neatly organized. On the other, you had questions, raw, urgent, and honest. The problem? The two sides weren't talking to each other. As he saw it, discussions about faith were stuck in the safe, sterile environments of churches and Bible studies. They were conversations for the converted. The model was to invite people into the Christian bubble to hear the message. But Cliffe started to wonder, what if that model was completely backward? What if, instead of asking the world to come to church, the church needed to go to the world, not just to preach, but to listen, not just to declare truth, but to discuss it. In the late 1970s, this was a radical thought. Public evangelism was mostly loud and confrontational. Think street preachers with megaphones shouting at people. The goal was proclamation, a one-way street. Cliffe's idea was completely different. He imagined a space where questions weren't seen as attacks, but as invitations, where doubt wasn't a sin to be shut down, but the starting point for a real conversation. By the time he graduated in 1979 with his Master of Divinity, this idea had become his mission. He felt called not to a comfy suburban pulpit, but to the unpredictable, often hostile, intellectual battlefields of American universities. He wanted to drag the deep, complex discussions about faith, philosophy, and ethics out from behind the stained glass windows and plant them right in the middle of the public square. He wanted to meet people exactly where they were, wrestling with their own questions and worldviews. He graduated convinced that honest, respectful dialogue could be more powerful than 1,000 sermons. And he was about to put that theory to the ultimate test. If you're still watching, you're the kind of person this video is made for, so make sure you're subscribed. With a seminary degree in hand and a revolutionary idea in his head, Cliffe Knechtle stepped into the real world. In the early 1980s, working with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and various churches, he started putting his theory of open-air dialogue into practice on college campuses. This was the marketplace of ideas, the place where the next generation's beliefs were being forged. If he wanted to engage the culture, this was ground zero, but the reality was way more intimidating than the idea. Those first attempts were terrifying. Standing in the middle of a busy campus, with students flowing around him like a river, the confident seminary grad suddenly felt small and out of place. His goal wasn't to preach from a box, but simply to start a conversation. But how do you even do that? He'd find a spot, speak for 5 or 10 minutes on a topic about faith or meaning, and then came the hardest part. He'd open it up for questions. At first, the response was brutal. He was met with mockery, indifference, and straight-up hostility. Students would walk by, snickering, Some would stop just to shout a curse or a sarcastic comment. There were long, painful silences where his invitation for questions was met with nothing but shuffling feet and people avoiding eye contact. It was humbling and ego-crushing. The urge to pack it in and retreat to the safety of a church must have been overwhelming. On top of the mockery, he had to face the incredible intellectual talent of his audience. He was talking to future scientists, philosophers, and lawyers at some of the world's top schools, like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. These students were trained to think critically. They came loaded with arguments from their classes and the skepticism of their professors, and they had no fear of challenging authority. They hit him with tough questions about evolution, the problem of evil, contradictions in the Bible, and the philosophical basis of faith. This constant intellectual pressure forced Cliffe to sharpen his approach. He learned fast that giving pre-packaged Sunday school answers didn't work. The students saw right through it. He discovered the real power wasn't in having all the answers, but in honoring the questions. He began to lean into a style that was less about showing what he knew and more about exploring how the other person was thinking. It's a style inspired by Jesus himself, who often answered a question with another question. Some counts put his total number of questions in the Gospels in the hundreds.
Too many Christians have said, don't think, just believe. That's idiocy. You know why? Guess how many questions Jesus asks in the Gospels? How many questions do you think Jesus asked in the Gospels? Over 290. Over 290. Jesus is always asking questions. Why does Jesus ask questions? He's challenging people to think. You better think.
Cliffe adopted this Socratic style. When a student threw a tough question at him, instead of jumping to a defense, Cliffe would often reply, "That's a great question. Why is that important to you?" Or, "Help me understand what you mean by that." This simple move was disarming. It changed the vibe from a debate to a collaboration. It showed respect for the person asking, validating their doubts and their journey. It also forced students to clarify their own thinking and face the assumptions behind their questions. Suddenly, Cliffe wasn't a target to be attacked. He was a guide helping everyone think a little deeper. The crowds weren't just there for a show, they were there to think. A typical scene would last for hours. Maybe 25 students would gather at first. Then, as classes changed, the crowd might swell to 500, with the conversation stretching for 2, 3, even 4 hours. An atheist might challenge God's existence because of all the suffering in the world. Instead of launching into a dense theological lecture, Cliffe would first just listen. He'd acknowledge the pain in the question. Then he might share a story or an analogy to make a complex philosophical idea relatable. One of the things that built his credibility was his own vulnerability. He never acted like he was morally superior. In fact, he did the opposite. A phrase he would use constantly, even decades later, was, "I am a dirty, rotten sinner." This was both strategic and completely genuine. It shattered the stereotype of the self-righteous preacher and told the students he wasn't there to judge them. He was, as he put it, a fellow wretch who found something life-changing and just wanted to talk about it. He'd openly admit when he didn't know an answer, which, paradoxically, made him more trustworthy when he did have one. Throughout the 80s and 90s, he kept at it, becoming a familiar, if strange, fixture on campuses across the country. He was building a reputation not as a fire and brimstone preacher, but as the guy who would stand there for hours and take any question, no matter how hostile, with grace and respect. The ministry he started, Give Me an Answer, was slowly gaining ground. In 1991, it took a huge leap when recordings of his campus talks started being broadcast on television. The quiet seminary graduate wasn't just talking to a few dozen students anymore. His radical idea was starting to echo across the nation. For 20 years, Cliffe Knechtle perfected his craft in the intellectual arenas of American universities. But as the 2000s began, his journey took a new turn. In 2001, after decades as a traveling speaker, Cliffe founded Grace Community Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. The church grew out of informal Bible studies and became a home base for his core beliefs, applying the Bible to real-life problems, building relationships, and serving the local community. He was now both an apologist engaging skeptics and a senior pastor guiding a flock. This double duty didn't slow down his campus work, it made it richer. He continued his Give Me an Answer ministry, but now his public talks were grounded in the day-to-day realities of being a pastor. He was dealing with marriages falling apart, family crises, and personal struggles, and he brought those raw, real-life experiences into his campus dialogues, making abstract theological points hit with concrete force. But the biggest change to his ministry was still on the horizon, driven by a force no one saw coming: social media. Starting in the 2010s, clips from his question and answer sessions on college campuses started showing up on YouTube. All of a sudden, a 4-hour dialogue at Stanford could be cut into a powerful 5-minute clip and shared with millions around the world. The patient, thoughtful, and intellectually solid style he'd spent decades perfecting was tailor-made for this new medium. The result was explosive. The arguments and exchanges that used to disappear into thin air were now saved online forever. A new generation, raised on the internet, discovered Cliffe not on their campus, but in their social media feeds. By 2025, his ministry had built a massive digital footprint, over 2 million followers across TikTok and Instagram, and nearly 900,000 subscribers on YouTube. The campus legend had become a digital age influencer. A key part of this new chapter was his son, Stuart. Also a seminary graduate and an assistant pastor at their church, Stuart formally joined his father's ministry in 2015. This was more than just passing the torch. It was a dynamic partnership. Stuart began co-hosting the campus sessions, appearing in debates, and running the ministry's rapidly growing online presence. The father-son team became a powerful picture of generational continuity. Stuart, younger and fluent in the digital world, brought a new energy, while Cliffe provided decades of seasoned wisdom. Together, they took on student questions on campuses like Yale and Cornell side by side. This huge online profile pushed Cliffe onto a national stage he never looked for. He became a guest on major podcasts and talk shows, having high-profile conversations with figures like Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, and Alex O'Connor. In an August 2025 appearance on The Tucker Carlson Show, for instance, Knechtle brought his campus-level insights about spiritual battles to a massive national audience. His influence grew so much that a single campus visit became a major event. When Cliffe and Stuart visited Yale in September 2024, over 100 students gathered for 6 straight hours of dialogue. A visit to Harvard in April 2025 drew huge crowds and even got covered in the student newspaper. He wasn't just an interesting guy to stumble upon anymore. He was a destination. Yet through all the growth and fame, the heart of his mission hasn't changed. It's still about honest, respectful dialogue. It's still about meeting skepticism with love, patience, and good thinking. And it's still about taking the conversation about God out of the church and into the public square. The quiet seminary student who felt called to leave the bubble has, in many ways, created a new blueprint for what public faith can look like in the 21st century. When you look back, the story of Cliffe Knechtle is really about the power of a single, unconventional idea, followed with incredible consistency. It's the story of a man who chose the hard road, who willingly stepped into the intellectual fire day after day, not to win arguments, but to open minds. He took the dense academic discussions of theology and philosophy and made them personal, immediate, and accessible. For over 40 years, from the analog age of open-air talks to the digital age of viral TikToks, his method has been the same. Listen carefully, ask good questions, and treat the person in front of you with unwavering respect. The quiet pastor became a campus icon, not through the power of his preaching, but through the quality of his listening. He built a legacy not on the number of converts he made, but on the number of genuine, thought-provoking conversations he started. It's a long, improbable journey from that seminary room in 1979 to a global stage in 2025. But it goes to show that sometimes the most radical thing a person of faith can do isn't to shout their answers at the world, but to humbly and patiently ask, "What's your question?